A child at the edge of history. There are moments in history so vast, so catastrophically human in their scale and consequence, that we struggle to comprehend them even decades later. June 6, 1944, the day the world came to know simply as D-Day, was one such moment. It was the largest amphibious military invasion ever attempted in the history of warfare, a colossal and desperate gamble by the Allied nations to crack open Hitler's fortress Europe and begin the liberation of a continent that had been groaning under the boot of Nazi occupation for nearly 5 years. On that single day, more than 156,000 soldiers crossed the English Channel and stormed 5 beaches along the Normandy coast of France. Thousands of them never came home. The beaches ran red, the sky thundered, the earth itself seemed to convulse with the weight of what humanity was doing to itself. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, amid the landing craft and the machine gun fire, amid the bodies and the barbed wire, amid the smoke and the screaming and the impossible grinding machinery of modern industrial warfare, there was a 10-year-old boy. His name was René Gondree, and his story is one of the most extraordinary, little-known, and profoundly moving accounts to emerge from the entire Second World War. It is a story about childhood interrupted, about courage that has no age requirement, about the way ordinary families become swept up in the tidal waves of history, and about what it means to wake up one morning in an occupied country and go to bed that same night, if you survived, in a liberated one. It is a story that deserves to be told fully, carefully, and with the reverence it has always warranted but rarely received. To understand what René experienced, you have to understand what the world looked like through the eyes of a 10-year-old child growing up in Nazi-occupied France. You have to understand the village of Bénouville, the bridge that crossed the Caen Canal there, the family that lived beside it, and the extraordinary sequence of events that began just after midnight on June 6, 1944, when the first Allied soldiers to touch French soil during Operation Overlord came gliding silently out of the dark Norman sky. Part 1. A Childhood Under Occupation. René Gondree was born in 1934 in the small Normandy village of Bénouville, a quiet, unremarkable community of farmers, fishermen, and working-class families situated near the city of Caen, just inland from the English Channel coast. By any ordinary measure, Bénouville was the kind of place where nothing very dramatic was supposed to happen. The landscape was pastoral and gentle, rolling green fields, apple orchards heavy with fruit in summer, the slow, dark water of the Caen Canal threading through the countryside like a muddy ribbon. The pace of life was dictated by seasons and tides and the rhythms of agricultural work, not by the grand dramas of geopolitics. René's father, George Gondree, was the manager and owner of a small café situated right at the western end of a swing bridge that crossed the Caen Canal at Bénouville. The café was a modest establishment, a 2-story stone building with a garden out back, a simple bar inside, tables where local men would come to drink Calvados and play cards, and upstairs the family's living quarters where George, his wife Thérèse, and their 2 daughters made their home. René himself did not live permanently at the café. He was staying with relatives at different points during the occupation, but the Gondree Café and the bridge beside it were at the absolute center of everything that would happen on the night of June 5th and the morning of June 6th, 1944. When the Germans invaded France in the spring of 1940, the world René had known collapsed with startling speed. France, which had long considered itself a major military power, was overrun in a matter of weeks. The French army, for all its reputation, crumbled before the Wehrmacht's fast-moving armored columns, and by June of 1940, almost exactly 4 years before D-Day, France had signed an armistice with Nazi Germany. The northern half of the country, including Normandy, came under direct German military occupation. Suddenly, the quiet village of Bénouville had German soldiers in it. Suddenly, there were Wehrmacht trucks on the roads, German officers billeted in local homes, swastika
flags hanging from public buildings, and a curfew enforced at gunpoint. For a child of 6 in 1940, growing up to be 10 in 1944, this was simply the world. It is one of the most disorienting aspects of the occupation to try to understand from a 21st century vantage point, the way in which children who were very young when it began simply adapted to it as the normal state of things, because children have no choice. They go to school if the school is still open. They eat what food there is. They play where it is safe to play. They watch the adults around them for cues about how frightened to be, how much to trust as strange uniformed men who have taken over their streets, how to behave. René grew up watching German soldiers cross the bridge outside his family's café every single day. He grew up in a world where those soldiers were the authority, where speaking out of turn or showing the wrong expression could have dangerous consequences, where a 6-year-old had to learn very quickly that there were things you did not say and things you did not ask. But René also grew up watching his father, René Gondree, do something quietly heroic that almost no one in the village knew about. Because René Gondree, the mild-mannered café owner who poured drinks for German officers and kept his head down and smiled at the right moments, was a member of the French resistance. He was, in fact, passing information about German troop movements and the fortifications around the Bonneville Bridge directly to British intelligence. His wife, Thérèse, who had grown up in Alsace and spoke fluent German, would eavesdrop on the conversations of German officers when they came to the café, and she would pass what she heard to Georges, and Georges would find ways to relay it to contacts who could get it to London. This was extraordinarily dangerous work. The Gestapo was not merciful to those it discovered. Entire families had been deported, tortured, executed for doing exactly what the Gondrees were doing. Every day that passed without arrest was a small miracle, a narrow escape that Georges and Thérèse accepted as simply the cost of doing what they believed was right. A 10-year-old child living in or near that café would have understood at some level that something secret and dangerous was happening around him, even if he did not know all the details. Children are perceptive in ways adults often underestimate. René would have seen the careful looks, the lowered voices, the way his father's demeanor shifted when certain people came in. He would have understood that the Germans were not simply inconvenient guests, but genuine threats, that the occupation was not a neutral thing but a violent imposition that his family was quietly resisting. This knowledge, absorbed through years of childhood observation, would have shaped him profoundly, giving him a kind of emotional and psychological preparation for what was coming that most children his age anywhere in the world simply did not have. The bridge beside the café was, as it happens, one of the most strategically important pieces of infrastructure in all of Normandy. It crossed the Caen Canal, and just a few hundred meters away, another bridge crossed the Orne River. Together, these two bridges, which the Allies would come to call Pegasus Bridge and Horsa Bridge after the gliders that carried the troops who would capture them, controlled the only road connection between the beaches where the D-Day landings would take place and the city of Caen. If the Germans could use that road to rush armored reinforcements to the beaches, the landings could be defeated. If the Allies could capture and hold those bridges, they would have a secure left flank for the invasion and a pathway for the advancing armies. The bridges were, in the language of military planning, critical objectives, and the family that lived right beside the most critical of them had been quietly helping the British understand exactly how those bridges were defended for months before the invasion. Part 2. The night the sky cracked open. June 5, 1944 was a Monday, and in Bonneville it had been an unremarkable day. The weather over Normandy had been poor, rain and wind sweeping in off the channel, and the German garrison soldiers who were responsible for defending the bridges had for the most part settled
into the comfortable routine of men who had been occupying a quiet provincial backwater for years and had largely stopped expecting anything dramatic to happen. The war, from the perspective of the soldiers guarding the Bonneville Bridge in the early summer of 1944, was something happening far away, in Italy, in Russia, on the Eastern Front where the titanic struggle between Germany and the Soviet Union was consuming men by the millions. Normandy was a posting, not a battlefield. The civilians of Bonneville had gone to bed as they always did, careful to observe the curfew, careful to keep their lights down, careful to do nothing that would attract the attention of the German sentries. René, whether staying at the café or nearby with relatives, accounts very slightly on his precise location, would have gone to sleep that night with no idea that anything extraordinary was about to happen. The Allied commanders had gone to great lengths to keep the location and timing of the invasion secret, and they had largely succeeded. Even members of the French resistance in Normandy had been given only the coded signal, a line from the Paul Verlaine poem broadcast on the BBC, that the invasion was imminent, not its precise location or timing. At approximately 11 p.m. on June 5th, as most of Bonneville slept, something unprecedented in the history of warfare was getting underway in the English darkness above the Channel. 6 Horsa gliders, each carrying roughly 24 soldiers from the British 6th Airborne Division, had been released from their towplanes at an altitude of about 6,000 feet over the coast of England, and they were now gliding silently,
Engines off, no lights, barely a whisper of sound against the night sky, across the English Channel toward the coast of France. The men inside those gliders were members of D Company, 2nd Battalion, Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry, under the command of Major John Howard. They had been training for this specific mission, the capture of the Benneville bridges, for months. They knew the bridges in extraordinary detail from aerial photographs, from intelligence reports, and from information that had been painstakingly gathered by resistance contacts, including, though he did not know it, a café owner named René Gondree. Their orders were precise and demanding: land as close to the bridges as possible, storm across them before the Germans could detonate the demolition charges that were fitted to both structures, and hold them until reinforcements arrived. It was the kind of operation that looked clean and logical on a planning map, and absolutely terrifying in practice. The pilots of the gliders, flying by moonlight and dead reckoning, performed what military historians would later call one of the greatest feats of aviation in the entire war. The first glider crossed the French coast, descended through the darkness, and touched down in a Norman field at precisely 12:16 a.m. on June 6, 1944. It came to a halt so close to the Caen Canal Bridge that its nose had broken through the barbed wire perimeter of the German defensive position. Within seconds, the other gliders were down too, their wooden frames skidding and crunching across the dark Norman earth, men tumbling out of the shattered fuselages, already running, already firing, already screaming the battle cry that would echo through history. Come on, come on! The Germans were, to put it mildly, not expecting this. The soldiers of the 736th Infantry Regiment who were guarding the bridge had never faced a glider assault. The silence of the approach, no roaring engines, no thundering bombers, just darkness and then sudden violent men appearing out of nowhere, was psychologically devastating. Within minutes, the fighting was intense and extremely close. Rifles and Sten guns chattered in the darkness. A German soldier fell into the canal and drowned. One of the British soldiers, Lieutenant Dan Brotheridge, was shot in the throat as he led the charge across the bridge and became the first Allied officer killed in action on D-Day. The fighting was brief but savage, and by 12:21, just 5 minutes after the first glider touchdown, Major John Howard could radio back to his commanders the code word ham and jam, signaling that both the canal bridge and the river bridge had been captured intact. 5 minutes! In 5 minutes, a 10-year-old boy's world changed entirely. The Gondree Café was right there, right as
the foot of the bridge, and the sound of the fighting woke the entire family. René Gondree knew immediately, with the certainty of a man who had been waiting and praying for this moment for 4 years, that this was not a German exercise or a local disturbance. The sound of British Sten guns was different from German weapons. The tactical approach was different. And there was something in his bones, the bones of a resistance man who had been living on hope and terror in equal measure, that told him, this is it. This is them. They have come. He and Thérèse hid under their bed with their daughters as the shooting continued. The children were terrified. The sound of close-quarters combat in the dark outside your window is absolutely unlike anything a peacetime imagination can conjure, even for adults who understand what they are hearing. For children, it was an experience that defied all comprehension, a shattering of every assumption of safety and normalcy that children carry as their birthright. Georges reportedly told his daughters, in a fierce and trembling whisper, that everything was going to be all right, that these were friends, that they must be still and quiet and trust him. When the shooting stopped and the British soldiers began to consolidate their position, one of them knocked on the door of the café. René Gondree, heart hammering, opened it, and found himself looking at a British soldier, the first free Allied soldier he had seen in 4 years of occupation. According to the accounts of those present, René Gondree, a grown man who had spent 4 years maintaining an iron composure in the presence of his enemies, began to cry. He embraced the soldier. He could barely speak. And then, because he was a café owner and a Frenchman, and this was the greatest moment of his life, he went into the garden, dug up the bottles of champagne he had buried there when the Germans came in 1940, and began to open them. The Gondree Café became the first building in occupied France to be liberated on D-Day. Part 3. Morning comes to a battlefield. As the night gave way to the gray, smoke-tinged dawn of June 6th, the situation around the Benneville bridges became significantly more complicated. Major Howard's men had captured the bridges, yes, but they were a small force, barely 150 soldiers, holding a position that the Germans very much wanted back. The broader Allied invasion was underway now, the beaches to the northwest alive with carnage and heroism.
But the men at the bridge had to hold on, had to keep the bridges intact and in Allied hands until the main force could fight its way inland to relieve them. That would take hours. During those hours, the Germans counterattacked repeatedly, with infantry, with tanks, with artillery. The area around the bridge became a fierce, grinding, close-quarters battle that would last most of the day. And into this battlefield, on the morning of June 6, 1944, came a 10-year-old boy. This is the part of the story that defies easy dramatization, because the raw facts of it are already so extraordinary that embellishment feels not just unnecessary but actually insulting. René, whether coming from the café itself or arriving from nearby, was present at and around the Gondree café during the fighting on D-Day morning. Accounts from British veterans who were there confirm his presence. He was there when the wounded were brought to the café, which was being used as an improvised aid station. He was there when the fighting raged along the banks of the canal. He was a 10-year-old child navigating a World War II battle. What did René actually experience during those hours? This is where we have to work carefully, drawing on survivor testimonies, historical records, and the later accounts René himself gave as an adult, to try to reconstruct the reality of what it was like to be a child in that place on that day. And what emerges from those sources is a portrait of extraordinary childhood resilience in the face of something that no adult, let alone a child, was designed to endure. The sounds alone would have been overwhelming to a degree that is very difficult to convey to anyone who has not experienced close combat. The D-Day area was not quiet after the glider troops landed. It became progressively
louder and more violent as the morning wore on. Artillery shells from German units further inland began falling in and around Bénouville. Machine guns chattered back and forth across the canal. German tanks, Panzer IVs, and the feared Panzer Vs with their long-barreled 75mm guns approached the bridge and were engaged by the British Piat anti-tank weapons, a weapon that had to be fired from very close range and required extraordinary nerve to use. Soldiers on both sides were being killed and wounded within a few hundred meters of where René was. The café, as noted, became an aid station. British medics brought wounded soldiers inside, men with bullet wounds, shrapnel wounds, blast injuries, wounds of a kind that are mercifully rare in peacetime life and absolutely common in modern combat. René Gondree, who was trained as a nurse, helped treat the wounded alongside the British medical personnel. Georges continued to keep order, to share what food and drink they had, to translate when his English was needed. And René, 10 years old, frightened beyond any fear a child should have to know, but present, watching, helping in whatever small ways a 10-year-old could help, was there for all of it. In later interviews, René spoke about the experience with the reflective clarity of someone who had spent decades processing something that was very nearly impossible to process. He described the fear, yes, the gut-dropping, physical, animal fear of combat nearby, the way your body responds to the sound of artillery with a primal urgency that bypasses rational thought entirely. He described watching men die. He described the wounded being carried in, the blood on the café floor, the expressions on the faces of soldiers who were very young. Many of the British paratroopers were 18, 19, 20 years old, and who were trying very hard to be brave. He described the kindness that some of those soldiers showed him, the way a few of them, in the intervals between fighting, found a moment to smile at the small French boy watching them with enormous dark eyes, to ruffle his hair or share a piece of chocolate from their rations. There is something almost unbearably moving about that image, the young British soldiers, barely adults themselves, pausing in the middle of a battle to be gentle with a child. It speaks to something fundamental about human decency, about the way ordinary goodness persists even in conditions designed to extinguish it. Those soldiers were terrified too. They were exhausted. Many of them had friends who were already dead. And yet they found it in themselves to look at a 10-year-old French boy and see a child who needed reassurance, and to give him what little reassurance they could spare. By midday on June 6th, the bridgehead at Bénouville was holding, but only barely. The German counterattacks had been fierce, and had come close to retaking the bridge on several occasions. One particularly intense moment came when a German Panzer IV approached to within point-blank range of the bridge, before being knocked out by a Piat round fired by Sergeant Charles Thornton. The explosion of the tank was enormous, the kind of detonation that sends a physical shockwave through the air, that you feel in your chest and your teeth, and that leaves a ringing in your ears that lasts for hours. René experienced this and moments like it not as historical events to be studied later, but as immediate, overwhelming sensory realities happening around his small body. The relief finally came in the early afternoon, when the first troops from the main invasion force, men from the 3rd Infantry Division who had come ashore on Sword Beach and fought their way inland through hours of brutal combat, reached the bridges. They were led famously by Lord Lovat's 1st Special Service Brigade, accompanied by the brigade piper Bill Millen, who played his pipes as he walked across the bridge,
an act of extraordinary, almost theatrical bravado that became one of the most iconic images of D-Day. The men at the bridges, who had been holding on through hours of continuous fighting with no certainty that relief was coming, heard the pipes from a distance and wept. Some of them had been sure they were going to die there. René heard the pipes too. In his later tellings of this story, the sound of the pipes was the moment that stood out.
With particular emotional clarity, the moment when, as a 10-year-old child in the middle of a battle, he understood that the worst was over, that the liberators had come, that the occupation that had defined his entire remembered childhood was ending. The sound of a Scottish bagpiper playing on a Norman bridge on the afternoon of June 6, 1944, was the sound of the world René Gondree had known ceasing to exist, and a new one beginning to take its place. Part 4. The Weight of Liberation. What survival means for a child. It is important, when telling a story like this one, not to stop at the moment of triumph. The liberation of the Benneville Bridge was real and beautiful and hard-won, and exactly as significant as history records it to be. But it was not the end of René's story, or of his family's, or of the processing that a child must do when he has lived through something so far outside the range of normal human experience. The Battle of Normandy did not end on June 6th. It went on for another 2.5 months, a grinding, attritional campaign through the hedgerow country of Normandy that cost the Allies tens of thousands more casualties and reduced the city of Caen, just a few kilometers from Benneville, to rubble. The area around Benneville and the bridges remained a combat zone, or close to one, for some time after D-Day. The transformation from occupied territory to liberated territory did not happen cleanly or all at once. It was a process, uneven and often violent, that unfolded over weeks and months. For René, the psychological reality of what he had experienced would take years, arguably decades, to fully integrate. This is something that modern trauma psychology has helped us understand in ways that people in 1944 simply did not have the language for. What we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, the way traumatic experiences, especially those involving the threat of death, can lodge themselves in the nervous system and continue to generate fear and distress long after the danger has passed, was known in the Second World War era as shell shock or combat fatigue, and it was primarily recognized as something that happened to soldiers, not to children. The idea that a civilian child could be traumatized by exposure to combat was not a concept that had much traction in the medical thinking of the time. But of course children can be traumatized. Of course a 10-year-old who has spent D-Day in the middle of a firefight, who has watched men die, who has heard artillery and tank guns and the sounds of close-quarters killing, carries something of that with him for the rest of his life. René, by all accounts, was a person of considerable psychological robustness, partly perhaps because of the way his parents had prepared him for the reality of the world they lived in, partly because the liberation gave him a framework of meaning and triumph through which to understand what he had survived, and partly simply because of his own character. But it would be naive to imagine that he came through D-Day unchanged, that a 10-year-old child can witness what he witnessed and return to a normal childhood as though nothing has happened. What childhood could he return to, in any case? The France that emerged from the occupation and the liberation was not the France that had been. The collaborators had to be reckoned with. The physical destruction of the fighting had to be rebuilt. The economic devastation of 4 years of occupation had to be addressed. And every French family had to come to terms in its own way with the moral complexities of what the occupation had meant and what different people had done during it. For the Gondrees, the reckoning was in many ways positive. George's resistance work was known, and the family was honored for it. The café became a place of pilgrimage for veterans and their families, a tangible memorial to the first liberation of D-Day. But honor and recognition, while deeply meaningful, do not erase the memory of blood on a café floor, or the sound of a tank shell detonating, or the face of a dying young soldier. René carried all of those things with him, as he carried the extraordinary honor of his family's history and the weight of being, at 10
years old, a witness to one of the most significant events of the 20th century. Part 5. The Gondree Café and the Bridge that Nemours built. The Benneville Bridge, or Pegasus Bridge, as it came to be officially named in 1944 after the shoulder patch of the 6th Airborne Division, became one of the most celebrated sites in the entire history of D-Day. Veterans of Major Howard's D Company returned to it again and again over the decades. The café beside it, the Gondree Café,
the first liberated building in France, became a living memorial, a place where old soldiers came to drink and remember and grieve and celebrate, in the particular complicated way that warriors grieve and celebrate the things they survived. Georges Gondree ran the café until his death, and Thérèse Gondree after him, with a devotion to the veterans and their memory that was absolute and deeply felt. The café became part of the official D-Day commemoration circuit, visited by heads of state and dignitaries and ordinary people from around the world who wanted to stand where history had stood and feel, however briefly, connected to something that mattered. The Gondrees never charged the veterans for their drinks. They never treated the café as primarily a commercial enterprise. It was a sacred place to them, and they tended it accordingly. For René, growing up in the shadow of this history was both an honor and a responsibility, a complex inheritance that he navigated, from all accounts, with grace and seriousness. As an adult, he spoke frequently about his D-Day memories, giving interviews to journalists and historians, participating in commemoration events, keeping the story alive for new generations who had not been alive when it happened. He understood, in a way that few people can from direct experience, what the liberation had meant, not in the abstract historical sense that students learn from textbooks, but in the immediate, visceral, physical sense of a child who had been there when the shooting stopped and the champagne came out of the garden. One of the most poignant aspects of René's later life was his relationships with the British veterans of D Company. These men, who had been teenagers and young adults when they glided out of the dark sky above Benneville, maintained deep connections with the Gondree family throughout their lives. They came back to the café. They exchanged letters. They were, in a very real sense, the men who had liberated René's childhood, and he never forgot it. And they never forgot the small boy they had found in the café on the morning of the longest day. Major John Howard, the commander of D Company, became a particularly significant figure in the post-war history of the bridge. He returned to Benneville many times, was celebrated there as a hero, and maintained friendships with the Gondree family that lasted until his death. Cornelius Ryan, the American journalist who wrote The Longest Day, the landmark 1959 account of D-Day that did more than any other single work to bring the history of June 6 to a mass audience, interviewed Howard and other D Company veterans extensively, and their account of the bridge capture became one of the central stories of that seminal book and the subsequent film adaptation. But within all this history and commemoration, René's own story, the story of the child who was there, has received less attention than it deserves. He appears in accounts of the café's liberation, mentioned as the son of the family, a small figure in the corner of a much larger narrative. The historical spotlight, understandably, has tended to fall on the soldiers, on Howard and his men, on Lord Lovat and the Pipers, on the strategists and commanders who planned and executed the greatest military operation in history. Children do not typically figure prominently in military history, even when they were genuinely present and genuinely affected. This gap in the historical narrative matters, and not only for reasons of completeness. Children like René are important witnesses to the human reality of war in a way that adult soldiers, for all their courage and sacrifice, cannot be. A soldier goes to war with at least some preparation, training, orders, the organizational structure of a military unit, a framework of duty and loyalty and understood risk. A child has none of those things. A child is simply there, experiencing what
is happening with all the openness and vulnerability and unguarded perception of childhood, without the buffering mechanisms that adults use to cope. What René saw and felt and understood on June 6, 1944, is history seen from the most unmediated possible vantage point, and that perspective has an irreplaceable value. Part 6. What the children of D-Day can teach us. René Gondree was not the only child caught up in the events of D-Day and the broader Normandy campaign. Throughout the landing zone, along the beaches, in the villages and farms and towns that became battlefields, there were Norman children of all ages whose lives were shattered and transformed by the invasion. Some of them were killed. Many were displaced, their homes destroyed by the fighting or the bombing that preceded it. All of them were marked by the experience in ways that persisted throughout their lives. The experience of Norman children during the liberation is a dimension of D-Day history that has only relatively recently begun to receive the scholarly and popular attention it deserves. Historians like Mary Louise Roberts, whose book D-Day Through French Eyes examined the liberation from the perspective of French civilians, have begun to piece together the complexity of what the invasion meant to the people on whose behalf it was ostensibly being fought. And what emerges from that scholarship is a picture considerably more complicated than the simple liberation narrative that tends to dominate Anglo-American accounts of D-Day.
For the people of Normandy, and especially for the children among them, D-Day was not simply a deliverance, it was also a catastrophe. The strategic bombing campaign that preceded the invasion destroyed not only German military installations, but Norman towns and villages. The city of Caen, just kilometers from Benneville, was bombed so heavily that it was essentially reduced to rubble. Thousands of Norman civilians were killed. Estimates range from 10 to 20,000 for the entire Normandy campaign, by Allied bombs and artillery, by the fighting that swept through their farms and villages, by the chaos and displacement of a region suddenly transformed into the most intensely contested military theater in the world. Children who survived this experienced something that has no clean narrative shape. It was not a simple story of oppression followed by liberation. It was an experience of violent disruption in which the agents of liberation were also unavoidably agents of destruction. The children of Caen who survived the Allied bombing did not experience the liberation of their city the way the Gondrees experienced the liberation of their café. They experienced it from the ruins of their homes, from underground shelters where they had been hiding for days as the bombs fell, from a landscape that had been transformed into something lunar and terrible. René's story is in this context exceptionally fortunate. The Gondree Café survived. The family survived. The liberation of their particular corner of Normandy was rapid and relatively clean. The bridge was taken in minutes, the fighting moved on, and the café stood. René had the enormous psychological advantage of being able to place his terrifying experience within a framework of triumph and meaning. His family had helped make the liberation possible. His family's café was the first liberated building. The champagne came out of the garden. There was a story he could tell himself that had a shape and a redemptive arc. Not every Norman child had that, and it is worth holding those other children in mind alongside René, the ones who emerged from the ruins of Caen, the ones who had lost parents or siblings to bombs that fell from Allied planes, the ones for whom the liberation was indistinguishable in its immediate physical reality from the occupation in terms of violence and loss. Their stories are harder to tell and harder to celebrate, and they deserve to be told honestly alongside the extraordinary heroism of the soldiers who fought to free them. Part 7. The Personal Mathematics of Courage. One of the things that René's story invites us to think about is the nature of courage itself, what it means, who possesses it, and how it manifests at the extremes of human experience. We tend, in our cultural narratives about war, to reserve the language of courage for soldiers, for the men who crossed the channel and stormed the beaches, who glided silently out of the dark sky and ran across bridges under machine
gunfire. And that courage is real and should be honored without reservation. But there is another kind of courage that the Gondree family embodied, a quieter and in some ways more sustained kind, the courage of the occupied, of those who resist without weapons, who gather and pass information at the risk of their lives, who maintain their humanity and their defiance in the face of an occupation that punishes both. Georges and Thérèse Gondree, operating their small café beside the bridge and quietly feeding intelligence to British networks, were practicing a form of courage that required not the hot adrenaline of battle, but the cold, grinding, daily bravery of people who wake up every morning knowing that today might be the day they are caught. And there is a third kind of courage, harder to name and easier to overlook, which is the courage of the child who grows up in the middle of all this and somehow remains human. René did not choose to be at the Benneville Bridge on June 6, 1944. He did not choose to be born into an occupied country, to grow up watching German soldiers cross the bridge outside his family's café, to spend D-Day in the middle of a firefight. These things happen to him, as they happen to children everywhere who have the misfortune to be born in the wrong place at the wrong time in the churning of history. What he did have a choice about, or rather what his character and his upbringing gave him the capacity for, was how he navigated that experience, how he carried it, how he bore witness to it, and how he chose to use it for the rest of his life. To spend the decades after D-Day returning to the Gondree Café, giving interviews, speaking to schoolchildren and veterans and journalists, keeping the story alive with care and honesty and without sensationalism, that too is a form of courage. It is the courage to remain a witness, to accept the responsibility of having been there, to refuse the comfort of forgetting or simplifying. René Gondree spent his life being the 10-year-old boy at the bridge, not because he was trapped there, but because he understood that his testimony mattered, that the story of what happened at that café on that night was part of the larger human story of what we are capable of doing to each other and for each other, and that it was worth keeping alive. Part 8. The Bridge Today. The original Pegasus Bridge, the actual swing bridge that Major Howard's men captured in 5 minutes on the morning of June 6, 1944, no longer stands in its original location. In 1994, as the 50th anniversary of D-Day approached, it was determined that the bridge had deteriorated to the point where it could no longer be safely maintained as a functioning road bridge, and it was replaced with a modern structure.
But the old bridge was not demolished. It was carefully disassembled and moved to the Memorial Pegasus Museum that had been established nearby, where it is preserved as a historical artifact and displayed as the centerpiece of an exhibition about the D Company assault and the broader story of the 6th Airborne Division on D-Day. The Gondree Café still stands at the foot of the new bridge. It has been designated a historical monument by the French government, one of the only private buildings in France to receive that designation, and it continues to operate as a café and as a living memorial to the events of June 6, 1944. The garden where Georges Gondree buried his champagne is still there. The bullet holes in the stone walls have been preserved. Visitors from around the world come to sit where the soldiers sat, to drink in the room where the first champagne of liberation was opened, to feel the particular quality of history that inhabits the place. Every year on June 6th, the anniversaries of D-Day bring veterans and their families, heads of state and ordinary citizens to Normandy for commemorations that grow more poignant with each passing year, as the veterans themselves, now in their late 90s and beyond the century mark, become fewer and fewer. The generation that fought D-Day is almost entirely gone. The youngest participants would be approaching their mid-90s now, and most of them have died. What remains is memory.
The monuments that memory has built and the stories that witnesses like René Gondree devoted their lives to preserving. The loss of the veteran generation is one of the defining cultural challenges of our moment. These men and women, soldiers, civilians, survivors, resistors, carried within them a direct, embodied knowledge of what the Second World War actually was, an experiential understanding that no book or film or museum exhibition can fully replicate. When they go, something irreplaceable goes with them. The stories become second-hand, then third-hand, then purely historical, important and worth preserving, but no longer animated by the living presence of someone who was there and can tell you what it smelled like and what it felt like and what you thought when the shooting finally stopped. René Gondree, as a civilian child who survived D-Day, occupied a particular and irreplaceable place in that community of living witnesses. He was not a soldier. He had not chosen to be there, had not trained for it, had not framed it within the professional and moral structures of military service. He was simply a child who was present, whose family home was at the center of a great historical moment, and who spent the rest of his life bearing witness to it with integrity and care. His passing, like the passing of every surviving witness to these events, diminished the world's supply of living memory and made the work of historical storytelling both more important and more urgent. Part 9. History Seen Through Small Eyes. Why Children's Perspectives Matter. There is a broader argument embedded in René's story, one that applies far beyond the specific circumstances of D-Day. Throughout human history, children have been present at major events, wars, revolutions, disasters, moments of liberation and oppression, in numbers that history tends to ignore. The accounts we preserve, the testimonies we treat as authoritative, the voices we amplify in our reconstruction of the past are almost always adult voices. Children are mentioned in historical records incidentally as the objects of adult action, rather than as subjects with their own perceptions and their own understanding. This is a loss, and not just a sentimental one. Children perceive differently from adults, attend to different things, carry different assumptions about how the world works and what is possible. A child watching a battle does not see tactical units and strategic objectives. She sees individual human beings and extremists, sees fear and bravery in their most naked and unmediated forms, sees things that adult frameworks of military and political analysis tend to filter out. A child hiding under a bed while soldiers fight in the street outside is not processing the event through the lens of ideology or duty or national identity. She is processing it through the immediate, sensory, emotional lens of simple human survival, and that perspective has its own irreplaceable truth. René's accounts of D-Day contain observations and emotional notes that are simply not present in the military histories. The way certain soldiers smiled at him, the specific quality of the fear he felt, the particular significance for a child who had grown up under occupation of hearing French spoken freely by adults who were not afraid. These are not minor details. They are the texture of historical reality, the lived experience that mathematical casualty counts and strategic analyses can never capture. They are the part of history that makes it human rather than merely important. The testimony of child survivors of historical events, whether D-Day survivors like René, or children who survived the Holocaust, or children who lived through the bombing of Hiroshima, or children who endured the Rwandan genocide, is a distinct and invaluable category of historical evidence. It requires particular care in its collection and interpretation, because children's memories work differently from adult memories, because children are more susceptible to having their recollections shaped by later adult narratives, and because the power dynamics between adult interviewers and child witnesses are complex and require sensitivity. But when it is collected and interpreted carefully, it enriches our understanding of historical events in ways that cannot be achieved by any other means. Scholars like Robert Coles, who
whose Children of Crisis series documented the experiences of American children navigating the civil rights movement, or Judith Herman, whose foundational work on trauma and its aftermath have helped establish the importance of attending carefully to children's experiences of extreme events. Their work
reminds us that children are not simply small adults. They experience the world differently, process it differently, and are affected by it differently, and that a full account of any historical moment must include their perspective if it is to claim anything approaching completeness. René Gondree's story is, in this context, a reminder of what we lose when we tell history only through the eyes of soldiers and statesmen. He was not a soldier. He was not a statesman. He was a 10-year-old boy in a café beside a canal bridge, and the history he witnessed was the history as it actually was, unfiltered and immediate and real, and it is worth our full attention. Part 10. The Long Echo. D-Day, Memory, and the Lessons We Must Not Lose. As we move further from the events of June 6, 1944, the question of what we take from them, what we choose to remember, what we allow to fade, what lessons we consider worth carrying into an increasingly complicated present, becomes more pressing rather than less. The temptation, as events recede, is to simplify them, to reduce the complex and morally ambiguous reality of historical events to clean narratives of heroism and triumph that are easier to celebrate than to truly understand. D-Day is particularly vulnerable to this kind of simplification. It was, undeniably, a heroic and necessary act. The liberation of Europe from fascism was one of the most morally unambiguous objectives in modern military history, and the soldiers who achieved it deserve every honor they have received and more. But the full reality of what D-Day meant and what it cost is considerably more complex than the heroic narrative alone can accommodate. The Norman civilians who were killed by Allied bombs, the soldiers on both sides who died for causes they had not personally chosen, the occupied French people who spent 4 years collaborating with or resisting an occupation, and whose choices during those years resist simple moral categorization. All of these dimensions of the D-Day story are part of its truth, and all of them are worth preserving with care. René Gondree's story, told fully and carefully, helps us hold that complexity. It is a story of liberation, genuinely, unmistakably, beautifully so. The champagne buried in the garden, the British soldiers at the door, the first free morning in 4 years. These things are real and moving and worth celebrating without reservation. But it is also a story of a childhood deformed by occupation, of a 10-year-old child forced to navigate a battlefield, of a family that lived for 4 years on the knife's edge of discovery and death because they chose to do the right thing in circumstances where doing the right thing could get you killed. It is a story that asks us to take seriously the cost of what was achieved, not to diminish the achievement, but to honor it more fully. The lessons that stories like René's offer to the present are not simple slogans or easy applications. History is not a treasure chest of ready-made lessons waiting to be extracted and applied to current events. But it is an invitation to depth, to taking seriously the reality of what human beings have done to each other and for each other, to understanding the conditions under which ordinary people become capable of extraordinary courage or extraordinary cruelty, to appreciating the fragility of the structures of civilization that we tend to take for granted until they collapse. René Gondree grew up knowing exactly how fragile those structures were, because he had watched them collapse and then been present at the moment of their repair. He had seen what it looked like when the forces of totalitarianism occupied a community, the fear, the collaboration, the resistance, the daily moral calculations that ordinary people had to make under conditions of violent coercion. And he had seen what it cost to end that occupation, the dead soldiers on the cafe floor, the shattered young men carried in from the bridge, the enormous, grinding violence of a modern military operation deployed in service of a humane and necessary goal. That knowledge, experiential, embodied, the knowledge of a child who was there, is exactly what we need more of, not less, as we navigate a world in which the conditions that produced the Second World War are not as safely consigned to history as we might wish to believe. The rise of authoritarian nationalism, the fragility of democratic institutions, the willingness of human beings, under certain conditions, to accept or participate in the persecution of their neighbors, these are not historical curiosities. They are perennial features of the human situation, features that require constant vigilance and genuine moral seriousness to resist. René's father George understood this, which is why he risked his life to pass information to the resistance. René himself understood it,
which is why he spent his adult life bearing witness. And we should understand it too, which is why stories like René's are worth telling at length, with care, and without simplification. Epilogue: a boy, a bridge, a morning that changed everything. Let us end where we began, with a 10-year-old boy in a café beside a canal bridge on the morning of June 6, 1944. The sun is coming up over Normandy. The fighting around the bridge has been going on for hours, but there are intervals now between the bursts of fire, moments of relative quiet in which the strange normality of morning intrudes. Birdsong, briefly, before the next round of shooting. The smell of gunpowder mixing with the damp green smell of the Norman countryside. The sound of French voices and English voices mingling in the café, where George has opened the first of his buried champagne bottles. René is there. He is frightened, yes, frightened in the deep, physical way that only genuine mortal danger can produce, the kind of fear that you feel in your stomach and your legs, that makes your hands shake and your mouth go dry. But he is also watching. He is taking everything in with the total, unguarded attention of a child, recording it in the kind of memory that bypasses the filtering and organizing mechanisms of the adult mind and goes straight into the nervous system, where it will stay unchanged and immediate for the rest of his life. He watches a British soldier with a bandaged hand drink a small glass of Calvados and then, carefully, fold his good hand around the glass as though it is something precious. He watches his father speak to a young officer in halting English, the officer nodding, both of them smiling the slightly unreal smiles of people who cannot quite believe that this is actually happening. He watches his mother move efficiently between the tables where the wounded are lying, her nurses calm, a kind of miracle in the middle of all this chaos. He watches the light come up over the canal, the dark water turning gray and then silver in the early morning light. The bridge that D Company captured in 5 minutes, the bridge that the resistance helped make capturable, the bridge that everything hinges on, standing solid and real against the growing brightness of a June sky. He is 10 years old, and he is witnessing the liberation of his country. He is 10 years old, and he has already survived more than most people survive in a lifetime. He is 10 years old, and somewhere in the back of his mind, beneath the fear and the astonishment and the overwhelming sensory noise of everything happening around him, there is something else, something that will take him years to fully articulate, but that is already present, already forming. It is the understanding that this moment matters, that what is happening here, at this bridge, in this café, on this morning, is something that the world will need to remember. He will spend the rest of his life making sure it does. The champagne bubbles in the glasses, the soldiers drink. Outside, the guns are still firing. They will fire for many more months before Normandy is finally, fully free. But here, in the first liberated building in France, a 10-year-old boy is watching history happen and making a promise, not in words, but in the fundamental commitment of his attention, to remember, to witness, to tell. That promise, kept across a lifetime, is its own kind of heroism. Not the heroism of gliders and machine guns and the desperate, gallant charge across a bridge in the dark, but the quieter, more durable heroism of the witness, the one who survives, who pays attention, who refuses to let the experience be diminished by time or distance, or the comfortable tendency to reduce enormous things to simple stories. René Gondree
survived D-Day. He survived the occupation, the liberation, the long aftermath of the most violent event of the 20th century. He carried what he had seen with honesty and care. He gave it back to the world in the form of testimony, so that people who were not there could understand, in some small measure, what it had actually been like. It is enough. It is more than enough. In a world that forgets too easily and simplifies too readily, the witness who remembers truly is doing something the world desperately needs. The bridge still stands. The café still stands. And the story of the 10-year-old boy who was there when history turned, who heard the bagpipes coming across the canal and understood, at some level deeper than thought, that the world was changing, that story, too, still stands. It deserves to be heard and to be kept.